She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his contempt. The air grew colder the moment he stepped closer. A blind Latina woman, an old oak walking stick, and a moment of violence that unfolded in front of a dozen silent witnesses. But what that officer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he was humiliating had raised someone the system didn't control. Her daughter, Isabel Cruz, wasn't just a lawyer. She was assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of California, and what began as a casual cruelty, a moment so many might forget by nightfall, was about to awaken something this town had long tried to keep buried. Dear viewer, what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is a true account, a powerful reminder that justice doesn't always arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it moves quietly, patiently, through those who were never meant to survive, yet did. If this is your first time here, I invite you to comment below where you're watching from. And if stories like this stir something in you, I hope you'll subscribe and click the bell icon, because we share voices that don't always get heard. And every time you listen, you help shift that balance. Now, let's begin. There's something reverent about mornings in Mariposa Creek, California. Before the valley heat rises and the fields begin to shimmer, the earth feels soft, almost shy. The eucalyptus trees whisper low secrets. The air carries scents of dust and lemon blossoms, and if you happen to pass by Main Street just after sunrise, you'd likely see her, the woman in the red sweater, with her head slightly bowed, her fingers gliding across the handle of her cane like it was carved from memory. Her name was Teresa Alvarez, 72 years old, blind since a brain hemorrhage in her mid-40s, and still more precise in her steps than most could ever hope to be. Every morning she left her small stucco house at the edge of a citrus grove and made the same quiet journey to the bench beneath the old Mission Bell Tower. She never missed a morning, not even in rain. To the townspeople, she was Doña Teresa. Some called her the woman who still whispered rosaries in the square. Others knew her as the widow who sold empanadas from a cart in the ADS. Few, however, knew the weight she carried behind her calm voice. The heartbreaks, the battles, the morning she nearly gave up, and even fewer knew her secret pride, that she had raised Isabel Cruz, a girl who went from tutoring kids under a fig tree to standing in federal courtrooms arguing constitutional law. But Teresa didn't brag. In Mariposa Creek, dignity wasn't loud, it was earned, and it was quiet. You wore it not on your chest, but in the way you stood straight, even after life tried to make you small. That morning felt no different. Teresa moved slowly, methodically. She buttoned her cardigan one clasp at a time, tied her scarf the way her mother taught her, not too loose, not too tight. Her cane, smooth and worn from decades of use, tapped steadily against the pavement. The sound wasn't just practical. It was music. It was memory. It was resistance. Every step through the sleepy town was familiar. The cracked sidewalk near the library, the crooked tree outside Mrs. Delgado's shop, the faint buzz of electricity near the old power pole that told her she was nearing the plaza. She didn't need sight. She navigated through intuition, rhythm, and love, the kind of love that refused to surrender to darkness. Teresa didn't walk for health. She walked for agency, for proof, that she still existed, that she still mattered, that her body and her presence could not be erased just because her vision had gone. And for 27 years, no one had dared challenge that, until that day. A police cruiser had pulled up to the curb near the church. It was a newer officer, unfamiliar to most. Name tag, J.R. Madsen. Young, white, nervous-looking, but not enough to second-guess the aggression boiling just beneath his skin. He watched her from the car, then stepped out. She didn't hear him at first, but she felt it, the shift in the breeze, the way people stopped speaking, the sudden weight in the air, a presence that wanted to assert itself. The sound of boots hard, echoing, then a voice, loud, clipped. "Ma'am!" "I said stop!" She paused. Teresa turned her head slightly, her hand tightening on the cane. "Excuse me?" she asked, calmly. "I said stop moving." You match the description of someone we've had complaints about. Loitering, soliciting. Her voice stayed steady. Sir, I'm just walking to the plaza. But it didn't matter what she said, he approached. Fast. Too fast. Grabbed her arm. Too hard. And in that moment, in front of the florist, the bakery, and the morning commuters, Teresa Alvarez was no longer invisible. She was a spectacle. A blind woman being manhandled by someone sworn to protect her. People froze. Phones stayed in pockets. No one moved. Except for one man. Daniel Vega, a maintenance worker who recognized Teresa's voice. From the mornings he swept the square, he stepped forward. She lives here. That's Donna Teresa. She's not doing anything. Officer Madsen's jaw clenched. He let go, muttered something about protocol, walked off, boots crunching gravel again. But the damage had been done. Teresa's scarf had fallen, her wrist was bruised, her dignity shaken. She went home, quietly, made no fuss, but someone else did. That afternoon, Isabel Cruz received a call, and the next 72 hours would change the course of that town's relationship with power, silence, and justice. He had done something else. James Monroe may not have stepped in with his body, but he had eyes. And a phone. Shaking hands, blurry focus, half obscured by the lid of the cart, but he caught it. The sound, the moment, the crack, the way Officer Clenny didn't flinch. The video was only 24 seconds long, but sometimes that's all it takes to crack open the lie of a town that claims it doesn't have problems. He didn't know what to do with it at first. He paced, he nearly deleted it. Then he called his sister Naomi. She was a grad student at Howard, sharp as a blade, and not one to hold her tongue. When she saw the clip, she didn't blink. "You send that to me," she said, "and you back it up in 3 places. I'm not playing." By sundown, it was posted. No hashtags, no commentary, just a title. Franklin Square, this morning. Officer 2447. Within hours, it spread, quietly at first, then louder. Naomi uploaded it to Twitter, then TikTok, then Instagram. By morning, it had reached 250,000 views. No names, no location tag, but people knew. The bakery sign in the background, the statue of the old judge near the bridge. Anyone who lived in Franklin Square knew exactly where it was and who it was. Claudine didn't know any of this that morning. She was still sitting at her kitchen table, hands curled around a lukewarm cup of tea, the broken cane lying on a linen napkin like the body of someone she'd loved. She hadn't moved much, hadn't eaten, just breathed, in and out, measured. Her radio played softly in the corner, a gospel station out of Charleston, and every once in a while she hummed under her breath, the tune catching only when the shaking stopped long enough to hold a note. She didn't need the internet to feel the shift. The calls started around 9:00 a.m. First her neighbor, Mrs. Templeton, then a deacon from her church, then a reporter who she didn't speak to. By midday, her granddaughter showed up on the porch, red-eyed and furious. "Emma," she said, voice trembling, "why didn't you call me?" Claudine didn't answer right away. She just gestured to the table. The young woman walked in, saw the cane, and stopped. Her eyes welled. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She sat beside her grandmother, took one of her hands in hers, and said nothing. Because what do you say when the world breaks something sacred and calls it routine? By noon, city officials were already in a tailspin. The mayor had seen the video. So had the police chief, who, until that morning, had described Officer Clean as a bit blunt but harmless. Now, with pressure mounting and news outlets beginning to call, that same chief was suddenly deeply disturbed by what appeared to be an unnecessary and aggressive encounter. They used words like review, protocol, training deficiencies. Not once did they say violence. Not once did they say blind. Not once did they say black. But the town said it in hushed conversations at the diner, in whispered admissions at the church fish fry that night. They said what they'd been taught not to say, that maybe Claudine wasn't the first, just the first who was seen, who was caught on camera, who couldn't be gaslit into silence because the world saw the evidence. James didn't go back to work that day. He couldn't. Not after what he saw. Not after the way Officer Clean had looked down at Claudine like she was a problem instead of a person. James had known her since he was a kid. She used to tell him stories about her late husband, when he'd help her carry groceries. She once taught him how to fold a flag properly. She called him Sugar, and he called her Ma'am. Now he sat in his apartment, scrolling through comment after comment, each one a mix of outrage and disbelief. You don't treat anyone like that. She's blind. He broke her cane. How is this man still on the force? And then there was one that stopped him cold. Does anyone know her name? I want to send her a new cane. James blinked, sat back. For the first time that day, he smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. He picked up his phone, tapped a message to Naomi. Someone wants to help her. Can we set something up? She was already way ahead of him. By that evening, a GoFundMe page had been launched. Its initial goal was $500, 0 cents, enough for a high-quality replacement cane. But within 3 hours, it crossed $10, 0 cents. People left notes with their donations. For Miss Claudine, your walk has power to help restore what should never have been taken. We see you. We believe you. At 7:16 p.m., a blue sedan pulled into Claudine's driveway. The woman who stepped out was dressed in a navy blazer, her posture rigid with purpose. Adrian Hayes had driven 5 hours without stopping. When her mother opened the door, Adrian didn't say hello. She stepped inside, placed a hand on the linen napkin, and said, "Tell me everything." And Claudine did. For the first time, Adrian listened. Her face did not change. Not until the end. Then she leaned back in her chair and said something her mother would never forget. This time, they picked the wrong woman on the wrong morning. Malik didn't move for nearly a minute after the video ended. He just sat there at his desk, fingers frozen above the keys, the hum of the DOJ's overhead lights buzzing faintly in his ears. The screen had gone dark, but the image burned behind his eyelids. The sound of that cane snapping, the way she flinched. Not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. It played again and again in his mind like a loop he couldn't break. He stood up. Slowly, his colleagues passed by in suits and heels, clutching case files and coffee, unaware that in that exact moment, something in Malik Hayes had shifted. A fault line had cracked. Within the hour, he was on a plane. No calls, no texts. He didn't want to warn anyone, not even his mother. He needed to see the silence for himself. He needed to feel the air of the town that had allowed this to happen. By the time he landed in Georgia and stepped out of the rental car onto his mother's familiar front porch, the sun had dipped low behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the yard. He could smell the honeysuckle, the scent of a childhood that now felt like both comfort and betrayal. He knocked once, then let himself in. Claudine didn't say anything at first. She didn't ask why he'd come. She just turned toward the sound of the door closing and tilted her head, recognizing his scent like a mother always does. "You saw it?" she said quietly. Malik nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I did." She reached out. He took her hand. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, "I wasn't going to tell you, not yet. But the world had other plans. It's not just about you," he said, voice tight. "It never was." She nodded. "I know that now." He walked over to the mantel where the cane lay, the two halves still wrapped in the linen napkin, sacred as scripture. He didn't touch them. "Detective Elliott came by," Claudine said after a moment. "She said there are others, people he's hurt, people too scared to speak." Malik's jaw clenched. "They don't have to be scared anymore, but they still are," she replied. "And I don't blame them." He sat down across from her. His voice was quieter now, but no less certain. "Then we'll show them how not to be." She raised an eyebrow. "You came here to fight?" "No," he said. "I came here to win." That night, the living room of the Hayes home became an unofficial war room. Claudine sat at the table, hands wrapped around a fresh cup of tea. Malik paced, phone in hand, making calls. Former colleagues, civil rights attorneys, journalists he trusted. He pulled case files, dug up old complaints, tracked down witnesses from the shadows of forgotten years. By midnight, he had a plan. By morning it had a name, the Hayes Accountability Act. It wasn't just about clean. It was about every officer in every small town who thought their badge was a shield against justice. Malik would go public, national news, DOJ pressure, civil lawsuit, criminal complaint, everything. All of it. Claudine listened as he outlined it. She said nothing for a long time, then she asked one question. Are you doing this for me or for you? He paused. I'm doing this because I have to, he said, because if I don't, who will? She nodded. Then, let's begin. The next day, they drove together to the GBI office. Claudine wore a navy coat, pressed slacks, her hair tied neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, which it was a piece of evidence, which it was. The front lobby quieted when they walked in. Detective Elliott met them with a nod. Are you ready? She asked Claudine. No, Claudine replied honestly. But I'm going anyway. She gave her statement with grace and clarity. She didn't embellish, she didn't falter. She spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone reading a sacred truth aloud for the first time. When she described the moment he grabbed her cane, her voice cracked. But she did not stop. When she described the sound of it breaking, Malik had to turn his head afterwards. Detective Elliott looked at her like someone who had just seen a lioness walk into a courtroom. You did good, she said. You did brave. I did necessary, Claudine replied. Back outside, reporters were already gathering. Somehow word had leaked, a news van from Atlanta, a microphone shoved near Claudine's face. Mrs. Hayes, what would you like to say to Officer... She didn't blink. Tell him thank you, she said. The reporter frowned. Thank you? Yes. Because now the world sees what we've been saying for years, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. By that evening, Justice for Claudine was trending on Twitter. A small rally began forming outside Franklin Square, where it all began. Students, mothers, veterans, elders. They lit candles, sang hymns, held signs that said, "Dignity walks here," and "She deserved better." James Monroe stood near the back, watching quietly. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. He had already done his part. At the front of the crowd, someone had placed a folding chair and a new cane on the bench where Claudine used to sit every morning, not as a replacement, but as a promise, that she would walk here again, that she would not walk alone. It's about the kind of justice we tolerate, Malik repeated, letting the words sink in. He looked across the room, familiar faces, old neighbors, some teary-eyed, others tense, arms crossed, not in skepticism, but in the quiet defense of lives lived too long in fear of what happened when you spoke too loudly. My mother didn't ask for a fight, Malik said, voice tightening. She didn't ask to become a symbol, but here we are, and I'll be damned if I let this town pretend it didn't see what it saw. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodded, phones recorded. From the front row, Claudine sat still, spine straight, her cane's two broken halves wrapped in cloth and resting gently in her lap. She looked like a judge at the bench, silent but mighty. Malik continued, voice firm now. Ernesto Stephen Clean is still employed, still armed, still patrolling these streets, but not for long, because this isn't just about departmental policy, it's about dignity, it's about truth, and it's about time Franklin Square remembered what accountability feels like. He stepped back from the podium. The room erupted, not in shouting, but in that kind of sustained, standing applause that means something broke open. Not just hearts, not just silence, but fear. That night, local news picked up the clip. By morning, it had hit regional stations. By the following day, CNN had called, so had The Atlantic, so had the Southern Legal Defense Fund. The town buzzed. Louder now. On the third day after the press conference, the mayor called an emergency meeting with the chief of police. Officer Kleine was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The statement was short, hollow, but Malik knew the game. He wasn't looking for a statement, he was building a case. Back at home, Claudine remained quiet. She didn't talk much about the coverage. She didn't ask about the growing list of attorneys offering pro bono services, or the civil rights groups reaching out with resources. She asked Malik about the garden. Did they fix the corner fence? She asked one morning while folding laundry. They will, he said. I'll make sure of it. That's how she moved through this moment. grounded, rooted, like always. But there was something different in the way she stood now, not just strength, a kind of stillness you earn only after surviving humiliation and turning it into fuel. One evening, as twilight spread across the porch, Malik found her holding the broken cane again, not cradling it, weighing it. "I've had this since your father passed," she said. "I know. I leaned on it, like I leaned on him," she added. "And when it broke, for a moment, I thought maybe I broke too." Malik knelt beside her again, just like that first morning. "But you didn't," he said. She smiled faintly. "Not all the way." He looked out over the yard, then back at her. "This ends in court, Ma. I know. You'll have to testify." "I've been testifying my whole life," she said. "They just haven't been listening." Malik nodded. And so the wheels turned. The case against Officer Klein officially opened within the week. Multiple complaints were reopened. Old victims, mostly black, mostly poor, started to come forward, some anonymous, others emboldened by Claudine's quiet defiance. A janitor, a teenage girl, a man who had been cuffed for matching a vague description, 3 blocks from his own home. Their stories poured in like water behind a broken dam, and through it all, Malik stood firm. He didn't use his title as a shield. He used it as a spotlight. Every interview, every panel, every article, he redirected it. Back to Claudine, back to Franklin Square, back to the countless others who never had a son in the Justice Department. Weeks passed, the court date was set, and on a clear Wednesday morning, Claudine Hayes walked into the courthouse wearing the same shawl she'd worn the day it happened, lavender, faded, proud. On her arm was James Monroe, his coffee cart shut down for the day. He wore a tie that didn't quite sit right, and shoes a half size too tight, but he held his head high. Inside, reporters lined the pews. Malik stood at the front, legal pad in hand. The prosecutor cleared her throat. "Your Honor, our first witness, Mrs. Claudine Hayes." A hush fell. Claudine stood, walked forward, and placed the 2 halves of the cane on the witness table like an oath made visible. "I swear to tell the truth," she said, her voice steady. And then she began not just the story of one morning in Franklin Square, but the story of a lifetime, of quiet dignity in the face of daily erosion, of the difference between fear and silence, of what it means to carry on when the world tells you not to. And as she spoke, you could feel it, something shifting, not just in that courtroom, but in the town. In the people, in the hearts of those who finally decided to stop looking away. The room fell still, not the quiet of indifference, but the kind that comes before something breaks or finally bends toward justice. Malik's words didn't echo because they didn't need to. They landed, heavy, clean, like gavel strikes in a courtroom that had long forgotten the sound of truth. Officer Klein shifted in his seat, jaw tight. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked away. Not at the board, not at the screen, but at the floor. Because guilt has a weight, and denial eventually buckles under it. The board chair cleared her throat. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice even, "are you prepared to submit a formal motion for departmental review and disciplinary action?" Malik didn't flinch. "I am. And I'm also prepared to forward this case to the State Attorney General's office for criminal consideration." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Reporters' fingers moved faster now. One of them turned to Claudine, who sat near the back, flanked by church members and quiet supporters who had come not to witness a spectacle, but to stand with her in the long shadow of something that had stretched across generations. Claudine's hands were folded in her lap, resting gently on the handle of her new cane. But her eyes, hidden behind glasses, faced forward with a calm resolve that looked almost ancestral. Malik continued, his voice steady but iron-wrapped. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about a vendetta. This is about a woman who was treated like a threat for daring to exist in public. A woman who raised a soldier, a federal prosecutor, a son who knows how the system hides things in files and calls it justice." He pointed gently at the evidence bag on the table. "This is not just a cane. This is the moment the silence cracked." He sat down. The chairwoman looked over the panel, Their faces were no longer passive. Something had changed, not just from the video, but from the clarity of what had been laid bare. "We will recess for 30 minutes, she said, "and then we will vote on the recommendation." People rose, buzzing, whispering. Some clapped softly, others just nodded toward Claudine as they passed. One elderly man in a World War II cap pressed a hand gently to her shoulder. No words, just shared understanding. Outside the boardroom, the parking lot was full. Cars that hadn't been there an hour ago now lined the street. The story had spread, not because it was shocking, but because it was finally undeniable. During the break, Malik stood on the concrete steps, staring out at the courthouse lawn. Claudine joined him. For a moment, they just breathed the same air. "You were right," she said, voice low. "About what?" "They do know who you are now." Malik didn't smile. "Not quite. Then let's make sure they remember." 34 minutes later, the board reconvened. The chairwoman called the meeting back to order and read the decision. By a vote of 6-1, the Fulton County Civilian Oversight Board recommends immediate suspension of Officer Stephen Kleen, pending internal affairs investigation and formal referral to the Attorney General's office for review of potential civil rights violations. Gasps. Applause. A low, collective exhale. Malik looked over at Claudine, who closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. She hadn't come for revenge, she came for restoration. And this was the beginning. But it wasn't the end, because systems don't change in a single hearing. They change with momentum, with public will, with people refusing to go back to sleep. That momentum came fast. By the following week, Claudine's story had aired on every major news network. Blind woman's broken cane becomes national symbol. Read the banner on MSNBC. CNN's segment titled "The Snap Heard Across the South" featured Claudine, Malik, and even James Monroe, who told the story of his shaky hands and sudden courage. Churches held community walks in her honor. Not marches, but walks. Slow, quiet processions through neighborhoods once patrolled by fear. In one of them, a little girl carried a white cane made of cardboard. Her sign read, "I walk for Miss Claudine." Donations poured in. Not for legal fees, Malik had those covered, but for something bigger, a foundation. The Hayes Trust for Public Dignity was announced 10 days later. Its mission, to protect and empower elders, the disabled, and the unseen, those whose stories rarely make it past local whispers. Claudine didn't want her name on it, but Malik insisted. "You didn't ask for this, Ma," he said, "but you answered." She didn't argue. She just nodded. And in the weeks that followed, Franklin Square changed. Not overnight, not all at once, but signs appeared. Small things. A new pedestrian bell system near the square. Benches with Braille plaques. Officer trainings that included community elders as consultants. A mural of Claudine, not grand, not exaggerated, just her sitting under the elm tree, a cane resting across her lap, head lifted slightly to the wind. And as for Officer Kleen, he faced criminal charges in the fall. The trial was quiet. Claudine testified again, same tone, same calm. The courtroom sat in stillness as she told the story, not with outrage, but with undeniable clarity. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Guilty conduct assault of a vulnerable adult sentencing was pending, but consequences had finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, Malik gave no speech. He simply stood beside his mother as cameras flashed. She didn't say much either. She just looked into the lens of one reporter and said, "We walk forward, one step at a time." And then they did. Back home that night, Claudine stood at her front door while Malik packed his suitcase. "You going back to D.C.?" she asked. He nodded. "For now, but not forever," she smiled. "You'll know when it's time." He paused at the threshold, then turned. "You gave me my spine, Ma. The rest was just practice." She chuckled softly. "Well, baby, you're ready." As he disappeared down the path, Claudine closed the door behind her, walked to the mantel, and placed the broken cane, still in its evidence bag, in a simple wooden shadow box. Next to it, she placed a plaque, not for the world, just for her. Let them hear the snap, but never forget the silence before it. At the edge of Franklin Square, a small group had gathered, not out of protest, not out of anger, but to witness. There were no megaphones, no chants, just quiet reverence. A folding table with paper cups of sweet tea, a young girl sketching Claudine's face in a notebook. 2 city workers had come on their lunch break, still in uniform, and at the front stood James Monroe, his old coffee cart parked neatly behind him, flowers tucked into the cup holder. As Claudine approached, the group straightened, not out of obligation but respect. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed to still the morning. Her cane tapped confidently along the stone path and the crowd parted like water. No applause, no announcement, just heads nodding, hands touching hearts, a few whispers of, "She's here." James stepped forward first. "I saved you a spot," he said gently, pointing toward the bench under the elm tree, the very one she used to sit on each morning before the world shifted beneath her. Claudine smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than save a spot, James." She walked slowly to the bench, turned, and sat. Her cane rested across her knees like a staff of honor, and for a moment no one spoke. The wind stirred the leaves. A bird chirped somewhere above, and then someone in the back began to sing, a low, humming gospel tune, "This Little Light of Mine," soft at first, then joined by others, then louder. Not a performance, a tribute. And as the song carried over the square, Claudine closed her eyes. For a long time, she had felt like something had been taken from her in this very place. Her trust, her dignity, her safety. But now, it felt like something had been returned. Malik arrived a few minutes later, walking from the courthouse in his rolled-up sleeves, no tie. He paused when he saw the scene. It stopped him mid-step, humbled him in a way no courtroom ever had. He walked to his mother and sat beside her. "They sang for you," he said. "No," she replied softly. "They sang for all of us." There was truth in that. Because Claudine's stand had become a mirror for others, people who had once felt invisible now saw their reflection in her strength. And in the weeks that followed, that strength took shape. The city council passed a resolution requiring de-escalation training with a focus on disability awareness. The police department installed body cameras, real ones this time, not just press releases. And the Civilian Oversight Board expanded to include local residents from marginalized communities, including a rotating seat held by a disability rights advocate. Claudine never asked for credit, but change carries fingerprints, and hers were everywhere. The town began to shift, not in headlines, but in habits. Kids started walking their grandparents across the square again. The bakery owner repainted her storefront and added a plaque by the door that read, "Everyone deserves to feel safe here." And Officer Stephen Clean? He was officially dismissed from the force after the DA pressed charges. He faced trial in the fall. The legal process would grind on as it always did, but one thing had already been decided. He would never again patrol the streets of Franklin Square. One afternoon, Claudine received a letter, tipped, formal, unsigned. Inside it read, "Mrs. Hayes, I wasn't brave enough to speak before, but I saw what happened, and I want you to know I'll never be silent again. Thank you for standing when the rest of us sat still." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her Bible. That night, on the porch, Malik asked, "Do you ever wish none of this had happened?" Claudine looked out into the darkness. Fireflies blinked near the garden. "I wish that man hadn't broken my cane," she said honestly. "I wish the world didn't need so many reminders that we matter," she paused, then added, "But I don't wish for silence, not anymore." Malik nodded, letting the words settle. In a way, the town had returned to itself, but with a new rhythm, a deeper breath. The same streets, the same faces, but now, people walked a little slower when they passed Claudine. They said hello louder. They looked her in the eye. Because now, they understood. She wasn't just a woman with a cane. She was a line in the sand, a mother, a witness, a legacy in motion, and Franklin Square would never forget her steps again. Together, let's keep walking toward a future where dignity isn't conditional and justice doesn't have to be fought for alone. Weeks passed, but the ripples remained. Franklin Square, once quiet in its discomfort, now hummed with intention. The bench bearing Claudine's name became more than a memorial. It became a meeting place. People gathered there not just to rest, but to remember, to speak, to listen, to begin. School children on field trips stopped to read the plaque aloud. Teachers shared Claudine's story during civics lessons. Local activists began holding listening circles every other Sunday. And just across the street, a mural had been painted, nothing grand or flashy, just Claudine in soft pastels, her head tilted slightly upward, her cane in hand, and a single line painted beneath. Justice walks. It doesn't beg. For Malik, life didn't return to normal. It evolved. He split his time now between D.C. and Georgia, coordinating with legal aid clinics and helping local communities file civil complaints and navigate systems that too often swallowed them whole. The name Hayes, once just a whisper of federal credentials, had become something else in the South. Not just a name, but a spark, signal that someone would listen now, that someone cared enough to stay. And Claudine? She didn't ask for recognition. She still bought her bread from the same bakery, still wore that faded lavender shawl on cooler mornings, and still took her walks, slower now, but with no less purpose. Yet something had shifted in how the town looked at her. The stares had changed, no longer laced with pity or discomfort, but with reverence. People didn't just greet her now, they thanked her. For walking, for speaking, for staying. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, a vigil was held in Franklin Square. Not a protest, but a celebration of progress. Candles were lit along the footpaths, poems were read. A local high school choir sang a song they wrote called "Her Steps Were Never Small," and for the first time since it all began, Claudine took the stage. She stood beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, her cane steady in one hand, her words clear. "I didn't mean to become a story," she said. "I only meant to take a walk. But when the world tries to break your steps, you have a choice. You stop, or you keep walking, so others learn how." The crowd didn't cheer. They rose quay, slowly, in unison. Because sometimes the most powerful sound is standing in silence together. Later that night, Malik joined his mother on the bench one last time before heading back to D.C. "You know," he said, "a foundation in Chicago wants to name their youth justice program after you." Claudine chuckled. "That's kind of funny considering I was told I was loitering. They're calling it the Hayes Path. It's going to fund scholarships for first-generation law students focused on civil rights work." She tilted her head. "Sounds like you already made your decision. I just wanted your blessing." She turned toward him, one hand on his knee. "Malik, you've always had it. You had it the moment you spoke up, not because you were my son, but because you were someone who remembered where he came from." He nodded, eyes damp. "I still carry the broken cane," he said softly. "I keep it in my briefcase. It reminds me of why I started." Claudine smiled gently. "Good. Let it remind you. But don't let it become your weight. Justice needs fire, but it also needs rest." The following week, a segment aired on national television, titled "The Walk That Changed a Town." It traced the events of that spring day to the legal reforms that followed. Police review boards had been updated across 3 neighboring counties, several formerly dismissed complaints had been reopened, and 2 officers previously protected by the silence of procedure had quietly resigned. But perhaps the most meaningful part of the broadcast came at the end, when the reporter asked Claudine what she'd want people to take away from her story. She thought for a moment, then said, "Don't wait for pain to open your eyes. Open them now. Stand beside the people who can't always stand for themselves. And if you're lucky enough to have a voice, use it before silence becomes the default." The video went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. In homes, churches, schools, and community centers, the name Claudine Hayes became synonymous with something too rare and too needed: quiet courage. And from that courage, movement began. Not a march, not a single campaign, but a sustained, local, grassroots awakening. People started checking in on their elderly neighbors more often. Churches hosted free legal clinics. A nearby college launched a fellowship in Claudine's name, dedicated to training first responders in compassionate communication. And once, in a town not far from Franklin Square, a young officer stopped a blind woman walking alone. But this time, instead of suspicion, he offered his elbow and asked, "May I walk with you?" Because that's what legacy does. It ripples, it reshapes, it repairs. And for Claudine Hayes, the walk was never just hers to take. It was a path paved by all those who came before her, and now widened by those who come after. So when you pass through Franklin Square, pause at the bench, run your hand along the plaque, remember the cane, remember the silence, and remember what broke it. Not rage, not revenge, but a woman with grace in her step and justice in her spine. She walked, followed, and the road ahead has never looked more possible.